All right, let's dive into a topic that's absolutely essential for any serious UPSC aspirant, the Regulating Act of 1773. Now, this wasn't just some dusty old piece of legislation. Oh no, this was a turning point. It was the very first time a government had to step in and try to control a private company that had become, frankly, a monster. Too powerful, too corrupt, and spiraling out of control.
And that really begs the big question we're going to tackle today. How on earth did a private company, the East India Company, get so big and so chaotic that the entire British Parliament had to get involved? This was completely uncharted territory. It was a crisis, and it needed a solution nobody had ever tried before.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll look at the company in crisis, what went so wrong. Then we'll see how Parliament stepped in. After that, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of the Act's key rules. And finally, we'll look at why it's considered such a landmark, but also why it was full of critical flaws. Let's jump in.
Okay, first things first, a company in crisis. You see, to really get why the Regulating Act happened, you have to understand the utter chaos that came right before it. This act wasn't just thought up out of nowhere. It was born from the flames of terrible mismanagement, a devastating famine, and a company on the brink of total financial collapse.
And believe me, things went downhill fast. In 1765, this new dual government system was put in place. Just 5 years later, a horrific famine swept through Bengal. And by 1772, the East India Company, this powerhouse of wealth, was basically bankrupt, having to go cap in hand to the British government asking for a huge loan.
So what exactly was this dual government? Well, on paper, it looked like a simple division of labor. The East India Company got the Diwani rights, meaning they collected all the taxes and revenue. And the local ruler, the Nawab of Bengal, kept the Nizamot rights, law and order, justice, all the administrative stuff. It was supposed to be a partnership, but in reality, it was a complete disaster.
And here's where it all went wrong. Just look at this imbalance. The company had all the money and all the power that comes with it. Their one and only goal, make as much profit as possible. Meanwhile, the Nawab had all the responsibility for taking care of the people, but he had no money to actually do anything. It was the perfect storm. Power without responsibility on one side and responsibility without power on the other.
And the results? They were absolutely catastrophic. Corruption was everywhere. The Bengal famine killed millions while the administration just fell apart. And the company itself? It was drowning in debt. So the bottom line is, the system was failing everyone. The people of Bengal, the company's own investors, and the British government. Something had to give. And that brings us right to our next section, Parliament's intervention. Faced with this out-of-control company that was now basically a ruling power, the British government knew it had to do something drastic. And that something was the Regulating Act of 1773.
Let's just pause for a second and appreciate how huge this was. This was a total game changer. For the very first time, the British state was saying, hang on, we have authority over what you, a private company, are doing politically. This move set a massive precedent that would define the future of British rule in India.
So, what did this act actually do? What were its teeth? Let's break down the key provisions and see how it tried to completely reshape the power structure in India.
The act basically attacked the problem from 4 different angles. First, it tried to centralize political power. Second, it set up a formal British legal system. Third, it cracked down hard on corruption. And fourth, it tried to give the government in London more oversight. Let's take a look at each one.
First up, centralization. The Acts created this brand new, powerful position, the Governor-General of Bengal, with Warren Hastings becoming the very first one. Suddenly, the governors of Bombay and Madras had to report to Bengal. They couldn't just act like independent kings anymore. But, and this is a huge but that you need to remember, the Governor-General couldn't make decisions alone. He was stuck with an executive council, and decisions were made by majority vote. He had no veto power. This is going to cause some serious problems later.
The second big change was bringing British law to India in a big, formal way. The Supreme Court was set up in Calcutta with a Chief Justice, Sir Elijah Impey, and 3 other judges, all sent over from England. Now here's a really key detail to remember. Its power was supposed to be over British subjects only, not the native Indian population. That distinction led to a lot of confusion. And third, the act hit the company right where it hurts, the wallet. It said that as long as the company owed the government that massive loan, the dividends it could pay out to its shareholders were capped at a pretty measly 6%. This was a direct shot, basically saying, you can't be paying out huge profits while you're asking us for a bailout.
So, when you put all these changes together, you start to see why this act is seen as such a landmark. Let's zoom out a bit and really analyze its long-term importance, because even with all its problems, its impact was massive.
The real significance here is all about what it started. This was the first domino to fall in bringing the company under Parliament's control. It was the government officially saying, "You're not just a trading company anymore. You are a political, administrative power." This laid the groundwork for a centralized British administration and a legal system that would fundamentally shape India for the next 2 centuries.
But, and for any deep analysis, this is the most important part. The act was not a magic bullet. It was deeply, deeply flawed. So for our last section, we really need to dig into its critical flaws. It tried to solve one crisis, but in many ways just created a new one.
Which leads us to this really important question for evaluation. If this act was such a big deal, why did it end up causing so much conflict and confusion? Well, the answer is in the details. The act itself was full of vague language and created a bunch of unintended consequences.
You see, its design was just fundamentally flawed. The intent was to create strong leadership, but then it gave the Governor-General no veto, so he was constantly getting overruled by his own council. It wanted a clear legal system, but the Supreme Court's powers were so vague that it just got into constant fights with the government. And maybe most critically, in this huge reshuffling of power, the actual concerns of the Indian population were almost completely ignored.
So, at the end of the day, the best way to think about the Regulating Act is as a paradox. It was an absolutely vital first step. It was the beginning of accountability. But it was also a clumsy, flawed law, an experiment that probably created as many problems as it solved, which is why it had to be fixed and amended down the line.
And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. This was the 18th century trying to figure out how to regulate a massive global corporation that had its own army and territory. So, what lessons can we take from its failures and its small successes when we think about the challenges of governing powerful multinational corporations in our own time? Definitely something to chew on.